a few new glyphs, some of them you know, like seek to be born, and I wanted you to look at the similar one, hu. It comes from hoch, iguana. It shows you an iguana head. Some early forms actually have like little paws. So you know it's a reptile. And there's a full form, like a full body iguana version, which is fortunately relatively rare. And then you have a key syllable. You'll see quite a few of those in weak for 20 person, often with a key phonetic complement. This is an early version, and that is a later version of the same sign. So they're just different fonts. That's why I put them together. So you can see the same idea of something that is bundled, but visually it's shown a bit differently. And now these two signs, I really wanted to include them because we keep talking about how transparent, like visually transparent my characters are. And this sign in particular, although it's got a little cut out here, is supposed to be very visually transparent. So this is an early form of that sign. And that crosshatch thing is actually all the way around it, like that. Can someone try to guess what it represents? So rather than being below, that crosshatch thing is around it, but a little further down. Any idea? So I have two objects, something like basketry or something like basketry around it. Is it a bean or maybe a cocoa pod? Now, well, think of basketry like something woven and like two objects, and then something woven around them. Pod is not too far, but it's not a pod. But it's not human-made either.
A nest?
A nest, exactly. The word klu actually means egg, like bird egg. So it shows you bird eggs in a nest. So, and that is also kind of basket, but human-made, and it has incense in it. Like smoking incense. And that's the word for chaf, liquid incense. So a basket with liquid incense and a nest with bird eggs. And they look kind of similar, especially when they get stylized. And when we say that, it's very easy for people to understand pictorial conventions. It's when you know the conventions, you go, okay, now I understand. This is a bird egg, this is an incense bag. But if you don't know these conventions, it's much harder. That sign is a tooth with a wood chip stuck in it. So it's chewed. We have no idea why. And then that sign is also a very specific object. I don't know. Anyone from the coast? Yeah.
Is it an oyster shell?
Sorry?
Is it an oyster shell?
Yes, it's an oyster shell. Exactly, like any kind of bivalve shell. Exactly. Awesome. So yeah, so visually transparent, but you have to be familiar. And you kind of wonder how many Mayans actually were on the coast to recognize the shell. But yeah, that's the idea. Excellent. Coming back to the verbs. You have to remember, right? So transitive verbs, you have two arguments, the agent and the patient. When only one of them is present, that's the intransitive verb. But there are different kinds of intransitives. Sometimes only agent is present. When you say like, Peter painted. Peter painted for a week. Peter paints every Monday. We don't care what Peter paints anymore. Same with the intransitives. You can say the chair was painted, and that implies that someone did it, as opposed to the chair got painted. You don't know. Maybe no one painted it, just painted itself. Now in English, those two kinds of intransitives are not grammatically distinct from active voice. In Mayan languages, those are separate voices. So you have active voice, Peter painted the chair, that's fine. Then you have passive voice, the chair was painted. But then you have two more voices. The first one is what we call anti-passive. That's when Peter paints every Monday. Peter painted for a week. And that's when you have agent and no patient. It's like the opposite of passive. That's why it's called anti-passive. And then you have the so-called middle voice or medium passive. That's when it's like passive, but no agent is assumed. Like the chair got broken, the chair got painted. So the middle voice is important because there are some verbs which are intransitives and which are like the middle voice of transitive verbs. There seems to be this, they share the same suffix. That's why I bring those voices up right now. But you have to remember that if you have a transitive verb, that transitive verb is going to have 3 intransitive voices, right? In addition to the active voice, which would be transitive, right? Peter painted the chair. There will be a passive voice, and by default that will be an intransitive. And there will be anti-passive, also an intransitive verb. And then there will be the middle voice, the medium passive. And it will also be an intransitive verb. So each transitive verb has 3 additional intransitive voices, right? Passive voice, medium passive voice, and an anti-passive voice, right? When only one argument is present. So Peter painted as a general action. That's the anti-passive, right? The chair was painted, passive. The chair got painted, medium passive. And then usually the active voice, Peter painted the chair. We'll come back to that next week when we talk about transitive verbs. Today, I want to talk about the intransitives. And we already discussed the aspect or tense in relation to intransitive verbs, but there are 2 reconstructions of how aspect or tense worked. The problem is that many Maya classes of verbs have tense or aspect unmarked. In general, that complicates the matter. But with the intransitives, what we see is the possible incompletive form with L, and then the completive with E. And that is that E is probably a phonetic suffix, and the actual marker is 0. Marks the actual status or aspect of the verb is incompletive. So you have achnel, which is more like participial, running, is runs and ongoing action, as opposed to something that has already happened. Achni ran. It's over, it's done. And then the E, it's either a marker of past tense if you're following John Robertson, or it's eclitic. So as he, she, it ran, or since he, she ran. Of course, it can be attached to the incompleted form, like as someone is running, since you're running, or as completed, since he, she ran. Of course, in English, there's no way to express completedness. Completedness, because we don't have status markers as part of our verbs. We just contextually understand those things, like whether you accomplished something while you were doing it or not. We are more concerned with tense, and my verbs are more about how accomplished the action was. So that's all from previous lectures. And these are examples. Achnel runs, ani ran, runs, since he ran, she ran, achni. Right? Achnel, achni, achni. Or bishnel, bishin, or bishan, bishni. So incompletive, completive, and completive with eclitic. These are what we call basic root intransitives, right? They're not derived from anything. This is their base form, and they're usually consonant, vowel, consonant, or sometimes just vowel, consonant, as in ochi. And in the completive, they have the e suffix, which seems to be the thematic marker of the intransitives. So you have ochi, ochi, chavi, chavi with eclitic, huli, huli. Of course, in the incompletive, you have hulel, chamel, ochel. Those forms are rare. Most of the things my inscriptions talk about have already happened. So they're in the completive. The next common category, you've seen examples of that, are these so-called change of state and transitives. And here we have overlap with the transitive verbs, the middle voice of transitive verbs. Because you can see how they're similar in meaning, like to close something as opposed to get closed, right? It's like a change of state. Or to strike something as opposed to like get stricken by something. Or to lose something as opposed to get lost. So get lost is very much like an intransitive verb of change of state. So it gets the same suffix. So the middle voice of transitive verbs. And these verbs, they are not transitive. This is all they are, right? Their basic root is intransitive. In fact, if you want to turn them into a transitive verb, you have to add an extra suffix, like to make someone go up, or to make someone escape, like to force someone to escape, to bring something down, right? So you would actually derive a completely different verb out of that if you want to make them transitive. So their basic natural state is change of state. Intransitives. You've seen some of those. Abai goes up, that's in your home assignment. Ubui goes down, Lokoi escapes, Yahmei goes down, I expires. So these are change of state intransitives. And they're easily confused with the middle voice of transitive verbs. Because it has the same suffix and overlapping meaning, right? This is one of my favorite examples of this change of state verb here in the participial form. So we haven't talked about participles. So we have the name of a throne or a building inscribed on a throne. So it's a bench in a palace, and it shows a celestial alligator, a big crocodile that floats through the sky and presumably corresponds to the Milky Way. This enormous cosmic beast. And the text goes, Ahin, sorry for the cutoff, Ahin, Sak, Shak, one of those two, Sak, Ikil, awakened seed, awakened white breath. You may remember those are animistic entities, parts of someone's soul. So two souls which are awakened, that's probably a perfect participle of some sort. Ahin, from ah to awakened, but not awakens or is awakened, because that's the ahal is awakening, like a present participle. This is a perfect participle, awakened. And then numul tachan, numul takab, literally passing, like is passing in the sky, is passing in the earth. So that beast is passing to the earth. And then you have part of the name of this crocodile is I know something crocodile place. So this is the place of the awakened soul, the seed and the white breath. This is the place of the crocodile that passes through the earth, passes through the sky. So like, imagine, you probably thought of something kind of meridian, right? The nadir through which everything passes. They claim that this is the center of the world, spiritual world. And then the text goes, Yotot, it is the house, and then of course the name of the king. His house is the place through which that alligator passes as it passes through the sky, through the earth. It's the place where the soul is awakened. A very powerful metaphor. And this is another example with the same verb, but now it's being transitivized. So to make pass. So you have the same num, then you have as, the transitivized, the causative suffix to make pass. Then you have ach, which is the suffix of our so-called perfective of transitive verbs, as in chokoch, scattering, mayich, gifting. And here it's passing, like in the sense, not like I pass, but pass me that pen or pass me that book. So that kind of passing. And then you have ach. Then you remember what ach is? As a prefix, ach. Sorry?
The glyph is the ear spool, right? Or is that ah?
No, the one that is basically like a bar. That we see with titles of origin, but also with professions. Ach. What does it mean? Ach.
I think it's called an agentive.
Agentive, yeah. So it's the agentive prefix. So the person who does something. So here we have to pass, which is an intransitive verb, as that alligator passes through the sky. Made, transitive, so to make, pass. Then a gerund-like ending, so the act of making, passing, or make something pass. And the genitive, the one who makes things pass. And the rest of the name is Chankinich. Literally, the sun is the one that makes things pass in the sky. I think it's a beautiful metaphor. Like, the sun is the engine that creates time and movement, right? It is the one that makes things happen in the sky, makes things pass in the sky. Everything that you see in the sky passes because of the sun. And it's interesting that the full name of that king from the side of Barangka was Achnum Sah Chankinich. But mostly they just called him Achnum Sah. Literally, the one that gets things done. The door. The person you call if you want something happen. He's the one that makes things happen. That was his sort of shorthand name. So we only have a couple of examples of his full name, Achnum Sah Chankinich. And probably close to 50 or something examples of his short name. And that suggests that he was really known as Achnum Sah, the one who makes things happen. And that was probably his reputation. He reigned for almost 70 years, served for emperors from the side of Tsibache successively and successfully, played ball with them, as you may remember, and left a dynasty that lasted centuries afterwards. So a very successful person, precisely because he made things happen. One important part about Mayan transitives is that they are often directional. So in English, we express direction with prepositions. In the hieroglyphic inscriptions, we only have one preposition, and its variant, ti or ta. And it can indicate location, and it can indicate like instrument, like with what or for what. But direction comes from the verb. So you have tali arrive from, but kotoi and huli arrive at. So, and I don't know what the difference is between huli and kotoi, but there are different kinds of arrival. In Turkey, spoken today around Hokotan, kotoi is much more common. Like that's how you say someone arrived somewhere. Then ehme is to descend from. Lokoi is to escape from. So you cannot say that someone escaped from or to somewhere. So you can only say someone escaped from, and then you have to use a different verb that basically explains where someone escaped to, right? So it's a different sentence. So for us, it's kind of hard to imagine that because most of verbs in English, they don't have embedded directionality. So we'll just use different prepositions. And then abai, also to somewhere. And in fact, it's not uncommon in the classic Mayan inscription to have ahni or lokoi followed by abai. So say lokoi may tell you where the person escaped from, and then abai would be the next sentence telling you where the person escaped to. And then pakash is one of my favorite. It actually means go there and back again. So in a single verb. In Spanish, they would say to go for a walk, like ir a pasear. When you say like, I went, on a weekend we went to town. So that's the verb that you would use, pakash. Because we, walked through a village, then we walked around, and when we came back, pilgrims, when they visit a place, they often do pakash. Because, you walk around, say Kaaba stone or some kind of secret place. Armies, they also pakash of the towns they conquered, because it's the same idea. You go, you take the loot, you burn some cities, then you come back. So a military action is also a pakash. And it tells you a little bit about what is actually going on. Here's another example with the verb of this change of state or middle voice kai for kai. It expires. Remember in the example with the throne, the soul awakens, the place of soul awakening. But here someone is dying, so the soul is expiring. The sak or shak, the flower bud or the seed, and the white wind. Kai, usak, il. And then you have an undeciphered sign that refers to the moon goddess. And then Ishku, lady god or goddess, common title of queens. And then a remarkable thing, Wakwi Hab Ishkalomte, lady Kalomte, overlord, and then Wakwi Hab. What would be the age of someone called Wakwi Hab? Any idea? I say so. Someone is Wakwi Hab person. $80? No, 80 would be Changwin Hab. Actually, either Changwin Hab or Howin Hab, depending if this person is older than 80, that would be like really Howin Hab. And this is Wakwin Hab. So how old is she? Sorry? No. What?
Is that 6 weenie hab?
Yeah.
So what is that? Over 120?
Well, she's in the range because remember, it's not how old you are in total, but in which 20-year period of your life you're in.
In your 6 weenie hab.
She's in her 620 years, so she's over 100 years old.
100, 120, yeah.
Her burial was excavated, but unfortunately, beyond certain age, you cannot tell how old somebody is. Because some old people just have decent bones. So beyond age, basically 60, 70, it can all be more or less the same. For the better ones. People who live into the 100 and something, they pretty much have healthy bones usually. Much healthier than people who die in their 60s and 70s. This is one of the oldest living people we have in Mayan hieroglyphic inscriptions. And probably she's called Lady Overlord. She was like matriarch, the true sense of the word. And then you have her Lady Shield something, an undeciphered sign. Lady Lord of Peten, that you can translate as island, but also potentially province. Lady Lord of province. And then Lady Bakab, Lady First on Earth. And of course, remember, Ish means female, right? So female ruler of the province, female first on Earth. So, and that obviously comes from a palace building commemorating her life. So it was part of residence, part of memorial. Like an ancestral shrine, the place where her spirit continued residing and you could communicate with her. There was probably a statue of her inside that building that you could talk to. And this is the process of dying, right? The person is dying, and you see I as a ka logogram. It expires. And then the fiery sak, the fiery seed, or mihin, spirit, and it ascends into the sky as a kind of part solar, part lunar disk. It becomes a celestial object. And then the nearby is Ochbihach, Ochbih, enters the road. And then the name of the person. This person is basically on his way, transformation, death. This is another example of that change of state in transitive. In this case, it's may, then it descends. And you may remember from the possessives on nouns, sometimes hard to translate. In this case, Mark Zender, who wrote the article on the decipherment of the logogram, suggested translating it as he descended from the house of his flint and shield. But you can also translate it as his flint and shield descended from his house or from their house. Right? So when you have a lot of possessives, there is a flexibility of how you're supposed to translate. You have to know from context. Unfortunately, in this case, it's not enough. So it could be his house, It could be his flint descending, or he could be descending from the house of his flint. All of these possibilities are there. Do not eliminate them. And here, the text that you already know, the downfall of the Lord of Tikal. So his flint and shield are hubui. They are falling. They're being overthrown. And the weapons belong to Nunuholchak, the defeated king of Tikal. That's a common expression for a military defeat. Your weapons go down and you drop them as you're about to flee and escape captivity. Of course, this text has a continuation. Those of the 13 divisions, their heads became the mountain, their blood became the lake. And that's the next category of transitive verbs. These are derived. So these are not root transitives, these are derived transitives. You take a noun and you add a vowel h suffix and you get a verb. So a mountain, to become a mountain or to pile up. A lake, and then you have to pull. Like in English, a lot of these verbs would just be same root, you just turn into a verb. So pull, to pull. A pile, to pile. So in English, you don't have to add any suffix to turn a noun into a verb. But in Maya, you add this vowel h, the general kind of suffix of the transitives. So, akot, dance, akotach, to dance. Hoi, some kind of debut, dressing, hoyak, to dress. Tak, drought, takich, to dry up. This is a great example. Someone is dancing, and the word for dancing and dance appears in the same text. So, as two captions. You see this young boy, he's 12, if you count his ages from other monuments, Chelo Chang Nich, and he's Uba Ti Akot. Uba Ti Akta. It is his image in the dance. His dad, on the other hand, is Ak Ta Ha. This is not a key, this is ta, this is just bad drawing. That kind of how stuff happens. Ak Ta Ha. Akta. And it's interesting that the king dances and his son is in a dance, presumably in a less active role, like assisting. Maybe he's holding another prop for his dad to pick up. So in this way, the author of the text allows us to discriminate between different roles, presumably, of people in the same event. The kid is in the dance, his dad is dancing at the same time. So, akta, akot, dance, to dance. And once again, in English, dance, to dance. The root remains the same, which change meaning. A noun just becomes a verb. You can also generate double compound verbs by taking a verb, transitive or intransitive, doesn't matter, and a noun. So, ojbir, to road enter. Tanlam, center diminish, or half diminish. Ojbir, ojwitz, ojha, water enter, mountain enter. This one is probably the strangest. Hulok. Arrive, foot arrive somewhere. Kalhun, headband. Bind. You can say the headband was bound. Achlach hun. But this person is doing headband binding. Alhunach. So these are all intransitive verbs. I don't know, anyone studying ancient Greek language? Has a lot of compounds like that, apparently. And it creates havoc in all the languages translating their liturgical text from Greek. Because even those languages, even when those languages don't have compounds, you actually get them. Sort of non-voluntary. For some reason, this inscription, it's a single inscription, has the highest concentration of these verbs. perhaps the author of the text was exposed to a different language where these compounds are more common. Say, the language fiction Teotihuacan. That's the time of contact between the Mayans and Teotihuacanos. Then modeled this paradigm, creating these endless compound Maya verbs. Some of them only appear in this text. Like the foot arrival verb is the only occurrence. To arrive on feet, or something along those lines. Ulokach. Rather unusual. But it's a productive derivation, even though present-day Maya speakers would not probably say that a lot. It seems to be part of this elaborate language of Maya inscriptions. Like, you studied, you got a PhD in Maya languages, you got your GRE, and you want to show it. And that's something we also talk about when we discuss who could read Maya inscriptions. It's not just that they contain words that you may not necessarily know. They create these, elaborate compounds, like grammatically heavy language, but presumably that adds extra beauty, extra poetry to the speech. Then, the other common class of the intransitives is positionals. Now, English does not have positionals at all. This category of the intransitive verbs does not exist in English. You may remember there's no verb to be in my languages. So when I speak inchoative and I want to say, how are you doing? I say, hocha tore, literally like, how are you standing? And the person would say something like, tonoren butz, toren, butz. Like, I'm standing just fine. And it sounds like a very strange conversation, like, how are you standing? I'm standing, okay? Or, our Father, thou art in heaven. Katat tachantum let, literally, in heaven you sit. But the same idea that, being somewhere has to be expressed through a positional verb, whether it's upright, or sitting, or lying. But position is always specified. It's very peculiar, and it has to be expressed with a verb. Someone is always doing something in space, whether it's sitting or standing, and that reflects, among other things, just being somewhere, being an act. And positional verbs usually have a nominal form, chumul, like sitting, like gerund, action. The participial, which is not very common in my hieroglyphic text, like chumul, like seated, or sitting. And then verbal, which is more active, to sit. When you want to express your emotion, your well-being, you think of it in terms of positional verbs. Like how you sit or how you stand, rather than how you feel. But in the same way, we can say, how are you doing? I mean, it's not about person doing anything. It's about person feeling well or not. And Maya don't think about person doing anything, they think about the person standing or sitting. And whether it's good or bad. Good sitting, bad sitting. As opposed to us doing well or not doing well. So slightly different kind of semantic orientation. Like you think always about bodies. And remember, there's no abstract direction in Maya, sort of direction that is separate from the body. So you're very much centered on your body or somebody else's body in terms of how you describe how your referential practice works and in terms of how you describe your emotional state too. So for some reason, the participial form is not common, but you have to think about it this way. Most of my inscriptions talk about events, like acts, so someone sat, or it can be a description of action, someone is sitting in the act of sitting, but not as someone is seated. That would require a caption to a scene, and those are not very common. Although we do have, I think, 1 or 2 examples of chumli, as he sat, as he was sitting, or since he was sitting. But we have a lot of chumla. He sat, or chumla he, as he sat, or as she sat, or since he, she sat. This is, of course, that nominal example, ubati chumul, his image in sitting, in the act of sitting. And this is uba, tichumul, each noun, his image in, sitting, in front of, the holy man, unique. And sitting has extra connotations in Maya languages. It means like being or performing your function because you sit in your job. You have to jumla ta haulelu, tia haulelu. You have to sit into kingshipness when you become something or into any other kind of office. You have to sit in it. So if someone isn't sitting, means you're kind of on duty, that you're performing your social functions. So it's a little more than just physically being seated. So Chumul. This is a text from the side of Labron and Suret's cut, but it's Chumlach Tia Haulel Kukahau. You may remember from last week there was Kanalahau, like Snakey Lord, as a personal name, and this person is Kukahau or Kukulahau, like Kitzal like person, Kitzal like Lord. And he sat into kingship, Chumlach Tia Haulel, and then 15 days Holahon Hail, and 17 months later, Huklahun Winiki, and then 2 years later, Shahabi, Shumlahi, since he sat into kingship, or kingshipness, Haulel, Tia Haulel, Kukaha, and then it will be like he went somewhere, he died. So it's a common kind of flow of narrative. In this case, they describe successive accessions to kingship and deaths of the kings of the same dynasty. He became king, and then so many days and months and years since he became king, he died. That seems to be a relatively short time span, just 2 years and 17 months and 15 days. Sometime during the classic period, the suffix of positional verbs changes. And that's one of the few examples when we can see the spread of linguistic innovation. So at first, it starts out as a dialect. So people in the west of Maya lowlands actually start saying, instead of chumlak, they start saying chumwan. Means the same thing, to sit, but with a different suffix. Like very much like dialects of English today. Imagine something starts out on the East Coast and then spreads across the country. Starts out on the West Coast and spreads across the country. So very much like our dialects, it starts in the extremes. Basically, Maya West Coast of sorts, around the kingdom of Palenque, the Bacal, the place with that throne, with the alligator that comes through the sky. Linguistically, they seem to be the center of the Maya world. They're trendsetters. They're a commercial hub, most likely, and the reason why these things are spreading from them. They sit on this major trade route of the Usumacinta River, and we're not far from the Gulf Coast, and apparently, what starts as a dialect at Palenque spreads through the lowlands. So it reaches eventually the other edge of the Maya realm, but it takes time. So it takes time, it takes, relatively large period of time, almost 2 centuries, for the spread to complete, for all of the Maya eras to adopt the new suffix. Very much like dialects sometimes spread, like grammatical forms of particular dialects spread and become mainstream. And that's the only case that we're aware of when a new kind of verbal ending emerges and then spreads out. So we kind of see the language changing in real time. Unfortunately, because Maya scriptures have so many dates, we can actually date the spread and it forms a spatial pattern. So my friend Zach Kruby, he was the one who discovered it. So he wrote a very nice article. Very, very straightforward once you put the dates. Then we get into kind of stranger categories of verbs. These are the affectives. So they're not very common, and they have the same kind of suffix, lach. But they're not positionals. Instead, they are really loud noises or really bright sounds or something that is very violent. That's why Mark Zender, who discovered this category of verbs, called them affective. Like the state of affect, like extreme emotions, extreme experiences. So, bach is hammer. Bachlach is to hammer, but not like acting with a hammer to nail something down, but making that hammering noise, like thundering. So, Bahlach chan kawil hammers in the sky. Like, kawil creates this very loud noise. The god of lightning creates this very loud noise in the sky. And this spelling just says hammer, bach. Presumably you understand what's going on, so you just add the suffix. It's abbreviated, bachlach, and kawil. So those are intransitive verbs because they express kind of activity. And it's interesting, sometimes the same verb can have a transitive variety. So yuk means to shake something. So you can technically be shaken. That'll be a perfectly fine passive voice of the verb to shake something. You can also be yubil, shaken. But then yuklak means shaking violently. So yuklak kaban, the earth shook violently. So when in Spanish they say sometimes temblor, they mean it's not a big deal. Like it's just, some shaking, but you can still stand. Terremoto, on the other hand, is a real earthquake. When people fall, buildings fall, it's really dangerous. So yuklach is that kind of shaking. Violent shaking. So sometimes we see verbs kind of present in both ways. So yuknom is shaker, the one who shakes. So from the transitive root, and see yuknom and the shaker of cities. Then yuk, then and, deriving an anti-passive action. And then om, the agentive, as in kayom, singer, this is yuknom, shaker. That's a little confusing because it's about what you feel, like what you mean when you say to shake. If you mean like a violent shaking, then it becomes an intransitive, affective verb, and you add the lach suffix. And if you mean just, shake, as in shaking normally, that's actually a transitive verb. And can be part of names. So you can see some of them are very similar. So you have yuklak chan, yuklak chan, kawil shakes in the sky violently. But you also have yubil kawil. Kawil is shaking. That is not violent, just shaking. From this transitive root. And then yuknom, shaker. Kachoplach chan kawil. A lot of these affective verbs there with lightning. As you can imagine, lightning is a pretty effective thing in itself. So hoplach is like flickering violently or extinguishing violently. So the lightning extinguishes or flickers violently in the sky with fire. Very emotive names, right? They're supposed to really highlight extreme phenomena. Because, of course, royal power is extreme. It's all about the monopoly on violence and ultimate authority. So the kings claim control over the most violent things like earthquakes, lightning, hurricane, sun, torrential rain. These are typical Maya royal names. So these are affective verbs. Fortunately, they're not very common. First of all, as far as events go, really effective events don't happen very often. We usually see them inside names, like royal names. Although we do have a couple of earthquakes. This one, unfortunately, comes from a stucco fragment, so we don't know where it falls in a sentence. We have a bunch of stucco fragments from the Temple 18 at Palenque, and one of them apparently mentioned an earthquake. But there is another text at the site of Tonina that actually has a date. That may be actually our only dated Maya earthquake. So they say on that date the earth shook. And they're probably very specific. They're not talking about some kind of metaphor, they're really meaning an earthquake. This is a less understood category of verbs, but they seem to generally function as change of state, intransitive verbs, and the suffix seems to be vowel n. There's only one verb that we understand, sort of, and that's to become a king, ahawan. And you can see how it's similar to positionals, like the same one or un. With clitics, it becomes ahawani, since he became Lord. This may be something else. This may be some kind of participle, or even a noun. But for now, people say, well, it's just a kind of intransitive verb. Just live with it. So grammatically, it's not well understood. That's, basically waits for its own publication. Someone will crack down what, linguistically what these things actually are. And perhaps it will turn out there are a few more of these verbs just scattered across the corpus that we don't quite understand yet. So you have ahau, ni for ahawan. This is ahau, ni for ahawani. And here it's a full spelling. Ahau, wa, ni, ya. Ahawani. So this strange misplaced ni, ya. Because you would want ya to be underneath ni, but it's not. So since he became Lord. So here's an example of probably one of these verbs, except they just didn't write ni at all. So it's just ahawa, and you're just supposed to add ni, ahawan. He became king. But then same thing happens here. Ba, chan, yopat. You're supposed to add la. So that person just doesn't like suffixes. Suffixes for people who are too laborious. He writes quickly. He drops suffixes. The scribe. And it's also a very small object that's a head of a scepter. So perhaps it's a space-related problem too. Like, why write suffixes when you understand what's going on anyway? So ahawan, bach, chan, yopat, u something wa. Unfortunately, we cannot read this. But it's another kind of hammer, so we know it's a verb. It's an affective verb, remains undeciphered. But it's another kind of act that celestial gods do in the sky. And then chan chak, so chak, doing that in the sky is fire. Holy King of Sal, Wakam now person. These are titles of Naranjo kings. Unfortunately, this object was looted, so we don't know where it comes from. But they're likely from Naranjo. It's made out of slate, and the slate was mined and worked near the site of Xanantonic, another subsidiary of Naranjo, not far away in the east. And the other side of the same text says, ta, once again, without no suffixes here. Maybe that's how the person spoke, like dropping lust. Sounds very much like Chilean Spanish. Have you ever heard Chilean Spanish? That's what happens. Suffixes don't happen to Chileans. Just the roots and perhaps the first vowel of a suffix, if you're lucky. And then ti, unkut. Unfortunately, we have no idea what unkut is, but it's something you dance with. It's very common in Mayan inscriptions when specific objects are described. They have no clear analogy, things mentioned in, say, colonial period dictionaries. But apparently you could dance with unkut. Maybe this object is unkut. We just don't know. At least until now, no one tried to explain what unkut is. And then you have the same name, just the second half of it. U something wa cha chak. Chak doing something in the sky is fire, one of those affective verbs. And then holy sa Lord, very much like. On the other side, also completely without suffixes. Without ul and sa without li at the end. So also no suffixes in most of this inscription. Then there is this category which is similar, but more clearly defined as inchoative. Now, inchoative generally means change of state. When we translate these things, we generally translate them as passive voice, but it's not exact. So say bak is bone, bak wak means to become a bone. And it sounds awkward, but remember, bak is also captive. So bak wak is to become one. But of course, if you understand it literally, it's much more poetic, but also very objectifying. Like you used to be a person, now you're a bone, you're a trophy. Bakwak. So instead of saying Chuhka captured, they say that person became a trophy. That person became a bone. And then nawa means to be presented, like to be displayed. And it has two connotations. Captives are displayed. For example, this particular verb, this particular example, akbalam, the claw of the jaguar, is becoming a display, accompanies Puri akbalam, on whom the victorious king of those pillars stands. So that's what it means to akbalam. But the same verb also applies to the bride emerging from seclusion. So in our home assignment, we talked about Lady Naman, Nawah, becoming a display. And it's interesting because the other text mentions Mahkah, enclosed, and then several days later she emerges and she is put on display, presumably before, in this case, Yonala is the groom's father. Although other Peter's Negros inscriptions mention senior wives as the ones doing the Ichnal. So this is more like a presentation of the bride from seclusion, emerging from seclusion, being presented. Father is important here because he was literally dying. He would die in a few days after that. So he really wanted to see his son getting married to a proper bride from a proper place. And we know from the text that the daughter was actually born years later. So there was like a child marriage, arranged child marriage. And so the parents presumably had to get it done before the father was dead. And so she was presented to him, and I'm sure he probably said something like, oh yeah, looks great, wonderful. And then he died like 2 days later. So his presence was very important there. Other inscriptions of Peter's Negros mention senior wives doing that. So presumably same idea, because they were actually doing the marriage negotiations and making these marriage decisions, not the husband. But once again, if we just translate it as a passive voice, we kind of forget what it actually means, right? To be put on display, to become a display. The same term also applies to commercial transactions, nawah. So in this case, nawah, spelled here with a wah, logogram for tamales, for cornbread. This particular scribe, and this is your inscription, by the way, that you're doing for your home assignment. He is, or she, not clear, I think it's a he as far as the scribes are concerned. He signed his name a couple of times on other vessels. But this particular scribe does not believe in logograms, or he thinks that logograms are just phonetic signs you can play with. So nawah, he literally used tamale just for the sound of it. Wah, nawah. Becomes a display. And then na, which probably means something like profit, or we know it as a percentage on a loan, like your gain on a loan. And then he says yukte, it is the tribute mentals. And it's interesting that the person paying the mentals and the person paying the loan, not the same people. So this is an example of Maya transactions. So somebody took a loan from the king and then collected the tribute to repay the loan. And this is a port city, so kind of easy to imagine people go on a trade expedition, borrowing from the king, and then the king is expecting to get some extra profit from it. Some nach, like overcharge on a loan, like interest. This is one of few apparent references to interest, some sort. A commercial transaction. And what is being paid is tribute metals, we actually see them here, the two bundles. And the Persian is called he of tribute metals, ah ubte. He of tribute metals. Here it's yubte because it's his tribute metals with possessive. And these are basically textiles of certain size. That's presumably why te stick is there. It's like sticks, but these are actually cotton metals of specific size used in commercial transactions. So it's kind of cool. And once again, this is what nawah is. So a captive being publicly put on display. Here they're presenting payment and brides. They're also nawah. And that's all. I hope it was instructive. Remember, there are these multiple classes of transitive verbs, and it's about meaning, right? Sometimes it's the same root, but the way you think about it, the way you record it, essentially changes the suffix, whether it's like shaking or shaking violently, right? And then we translate a lot of it with passive, was seated, was presented, but the meaning is actually somewhat different, right? It's not passive voice, but changing of state. Seems to be different kinds of change of state. That's what concerns Maya speakers. They're more centered on that than we are in English.